Those are the words my dad told me every night before I went to sleep. He would tuck the sheets around my body, kiss my forehead, and tell me he loves me. Then as he stood up and went to close the door, he would whisper, "Don't go into the basement." I remember looking at him, his massive frame cutting a silhouette in the doorway as the light from the hallway went past him and died in the darkness of my bedroom. "Don't go into the basement." The first time he said it, I wasn't even sure I heard him right. I thought maybe I was already asleep, dreaming words that had never been spoken. I asked him the next morning at the table. My mother, standing at the sink washing dishes. My brother, furiously finishing his homework. My father, leering at me with his dark blue eyes, his brow furrowed. He would just shake his head. I was in no hurry to go into the basement before he ever told me not to. The basement stairs were inside the house. The dark wooden steps cut deep into the guts of our living room. One side of the staircase was concrete and rock, the part of earth it had tore into. Cobwebs littered various corners of the stairs. There were many days where I would stand on top of those stairs looking down. I remember seeing a piece on television about underwater cave divers. I saw one diver squeeze into a pitch-black crevasse, one so tight he had to take the oxygen tank off his back. I could only imagine the intense pressure, the suffocating cold and darkness. I stood on the top of those stairs, feeling like the diver, staring into a dark abyss, shivering. There was no door on the bottom of the stairs, only darkness, the kind of complete and utter blackness where your eyes would struggle and fail to find anything they could cling on to. I knew there were no windows in the basement since none could be found on the outside of the house, but this darkness had always felt different. I would stare into it for what seemed like hours. Sometimes my dad would find me, swaying back and forth on the top of the stairs. He wouldn't say anything, just take my hand and lead me away. One night I had the most intense dream. I was rock climbing, scaling a mountain wall. Except it wasn't really climbing. I was being thrown upwards into the wall, smashed against the cliff face. I was scraping my skin, blood being thrown against the mountainside. My bones were breaking as they started to burst out from underneath my muscle. I looked up and screamed with horror when I saw that the mountain never ended. It just jutted up into the sky as far as I could see. The next morning, my dad told me he had caught me sleepwalking. I was halfway down the basement stairs when he found me and started shaking me viciously on my shoulders, slapping my face. Anything to wake me up. Eventually, he had to carry me back to bed and hold me down for an hour before I fell asleep again. "Don't go into the basement." He started saying it in the mornings too. Over the running faucet in the kitchen sink, he would whisper into my ear, "Don't go into the basement." I would look back at him, expecting a grin, a wink, a nod, anything. He would just look away and go back to reading his newspaper, milk dripping out of his mouth as he took big, slobbering mouthfuls of cereal, like he hadn't said anything. I was in the house alone when I went into the basement. My father was out, not expected to be back until the morning. My brother was gone, off into the real world. I hadn't seen my mother for years. I had been watching television, hitting the mute button to cut off a commercial. In the silence that followed, someone called out my name. From inside the house. I dismissed it at first, laughing to myself at my wild imagination. I put the sound back on and pumped up the volume. Everything was fine for a few seconds. Then the power cut off. The day's light had only just begun to fade, so I wasn't plunged into total darkness. I ran upstairs to grab a flashlight. By the time I came back down, the whole house was nearly pitch black. Living off the main road, I couldn't rely on streetlights for illumination, so within minutes I was forced to turn on the battery-powered mag light my dad had given me for my birthday that year. I peeked out a window and saw my neighbor's lights on, so I knew the power was only out at our house. I sat down on a kitchen chair and did the math in my head. My dad wasn't going to be home until the morning, at least 12 hours from now. The batteries in my flashlight were small and unlikely to last for more than a few of those hours. I could live without the light. My concern was the fridge and freezer. If I didn't open the door to either, I could keep the cold air in, but they were old appliances and poorly insulated. The food probably had 5 or 6 hours before it spoiled in the hot summer air. I was going to have to get the power back on myself by going to the circuit breaker. I knew enough that I figured one of the breakers had been flipped, so it was simply a matter of finding it and flipping the switch back on. Easy enough. I had never done it before, but I knew the theory behind it. And if that didn't solve the problem, clearly there was a bigger issue that needed professional help. As I stood up, I realized I had missed one important detail, and my blood ran cold. The circuit breaker was in the basement. My knees became wobbly. I was short of breath. In a span of a few seconds, my mind was fighting a civil war between the side that knew I had to get the power back on and the side that was screaming at me to never go into the basement. Before I could stop myself, I was at the top of the basement stairs. The beam of my flashlight cut through the black and revealed each worn-out staircase, but no light could penetrate past the doorway. Curiosity and rebellion took over momentarily. Why couldn't I go down there? I put my foot down on the first step and stopped. Physically couldn't move any further, frozen in perpetual fear. Profuse amounts of sweat was dripping off my forehead, some hitting the top of my flashlight and casting small shadows across the beam. I shook my head and decided there and then that food be damned. There was no way I was going down there. Then, from out of the basement, someone called my name. I think I fainted. I say think because the next thing I remember was the taste of dust, the feel of cold concrete, utter and total darkness, throbbing pain coming from my knees and head and neck. Only a few seconds were needed in order for me to realize I had fallen down the stairs. My flashlight had turned off or had broken in the fall. I tried to push down the panic and fear that was quickly rising in my chest. I was on my stomach, so I moved my arms and hands methodically around my body in case my flashlight was near me, but to no avail. I panicked more. I tried to will my eyes to reveal something to me, a shape, a wall, anything. I pushed myself slowly off of the cold floor, holding my breath and listening for even the slightest movement. An eternal few seconds passed while I tried to quiet the ringing in my head, courtesy of my tumble down the stairs. I mustered the courage to lift my arm and began the agonizing search for the only light available to me, a solitary light bulb with a hanging chain that I had to pull to turn on. I knew it was battery-powered. I'd seen my dad do it a few times when the power cut out during a storm. I would watch him from the top of the stairs as he walked down. He disappeared from sight, and I would count the seconds it took him to turn the light on. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The air tasted cold and musty, like rotted cardboard. I waved my arms a foot above my head, slowly circling outwards into the room. I had just brushed against something that felt like metal when I heard quick and ragged noises, like wind escaping a tunnel. I froze. Somebody was breathing. 1 Mississippi. I dared to whisper. Some semblance of a voice escaped my lips, so quiet the sound died a few feet in front of me in the cold air. Hello? 2 Mississippi. The breathing noises stopped and I was swallowed in the silence. 3 Mississippi. My arm was right above my head, stuck since fear had cut my brain and body from each other. Then something hard and cool touched my hand. I was too scared to scream. My hand reflexively shrunk back, my fingers tightening around a light bulb chain. I pulled down hard and quickly. The light that came on was brilliant and overwhelming, blindly me momentarily. As my eyes closed, somebody laughed. I screamed then, opened my eyes and screamed harder. There were dozens of people in the basement with pale, featureless skin. They were standing completely still, and I kept screaming. I was waiting for something to happen. In my nightmares, the people in the basement simply open their arms, and I'm sucked into a black abyss, my bones crushed and my skin ripped apart. I must have screamed for a minute or two. Nothing happened. Not a sound in the air except my wails. I stopped screaming, took a few deep breaths, focused my eyes, and looked at the people closer. I would have laughed if my heart and lungs didn't feel like they had been torn out of my body. Mannequins and statues. Most had been covered with a white sheet. There had to be almost 20 of them in the one square room. They were scattered amongst a few shelves that were carrying lumber. There was one statue in front of a small desk that was my dad's workshop. A few mannequins had been squeezed between a furnace and a water heater. There were about 5 in front of the circuit breaker. I let out a small sigh of relief when I saw it. I could see one switch had been flipped off, causing the power outage. I took one step towards the breaker, and I saw one of the white sheets move, turning a head towards me. I screamed again, and in my panic, ripped the sheet off. Breathed out when it was only a statue. Fear and panic were causing me to see things, hear things. Just my overactive imagination. Cursing to myself, I took a deep breath and flipped the switch on the breaker. I saw the lights go on upstairs and smiled for the first time all night. Then I heard someone whisper into my ear. Felt hot breath. Don't come into the basement. The next thing I remember was my dad, shaking me. I was sprawled out on the basement floor. I looked into my dad's eyes. He seemed older than the last time I saw him, weathered, like a stone in the desert that has been chipped away by the winds of 1,000 years. I started to cry. He didn't say anything. He just picked me up in his strong arms and took me to bed. When I woke up the next morning, my dad was sitting on the end of the bed. He might have been sitting there all night for all I knew. He just looked at me for what felt like hours. I stared right back at him. I couldn't wrap my head about what happened down in the basement. A long time passed before he spoke. He took my hand, looked into my eyes. I had never seen him look so sad. Even when Mom left, he held it together. Maybe not in private, but in front of my brother and I, he was as stoic as they come. In front of me on the bed that morning, my dad cried. Then he told me we were moving. That was 10 years ago. My dad and I never talked about that night. In fact, my dad and I rarely talk these days. He doesn't like email or cell phones, and I live very far from where he is now. Years have gone by since the last time I saw him. Today, however, I received an envelope from him. My name and address were handwritten by him on the front. I opened it, and a letter fell out. There were only a few words on a single sheet of paper. I read them over and over again, hands shaking. Meet me in the basement. I moved into this house 5 years ago, and today I found out it had a secret basement. I'd finally got round to doing the renovations. Saving up for mortgage deposit damn near emptied my bank. Rebalancing the books took a few years and a promotion from junior to senior data scientist with a Silicon Valley I worked for remotely. Once I had, the next step was finally fixing the place up. Took me a while. Materials and labor cost a fair bit after all. That's also why I decided to try and do as much as I could myself, even though I know fuck all about DIY. Mom and Dad helped me find the house and chipped in a bit on the down payment. Maybe if I'd told them about my renovation plans instead of trying to make it a surprise, they'd have stopped me. A family friend, Hank, hooked me up. Wasn't a realtor, but knew people about town, managed to convince the seller to hold off before it hit the market, and got snapped up by some rich cubicle monkey from the city looking for a summer home. I didn't meet the previous owner, didn't think to ask. I thought I'd struck gold when I took the keys, but now I'm starting to connect the dots. I never saw who used to own the place. Mom and Dad handled all the paperwork, and I'm guessing it was Hank. I did one afternoon of DIY, and now I'd happily let the bank keep the house and mortgage as long as they let me leave town. This is the first house I've owned, the second I've ever called home, and I don't feel safe in either. I've lived in Marathon all my life and decided long ago I'd never move away. All that's changed. After today, I'd take living literally anywhere else, even Pyongyang or Kabul. I found the door to the secret basement by total accident. Carrying my dad's sledgehammer up the stairs, I slipped and dropped the damn thing. It thudded back down the staircase and embedded itself in the wall at the bottom. The hole left when I pulled it out exposed the wall cavity within. I couldn't ignore the handrail or the fact the wall cavity was wide enough to walk down. That's of course what I did, and I found the door to the basement at the end of the secret corridor. My honest first thoughts. Annoyed, but quietly hopeful this meant the house had more space than on the plans. If I knocked out his wall, the living room would be much bigger, adding thousands to the property value. If it had an entire basement, then, well, that could potentially be a whole extra floor. I hadn't been planning to flip the house, I wanted to live in it, but the chance to add an additional floor would add so much to the listed value I might not be able to resist. The door wasn't ominous, you understand. It looked like the rest of the doors in the house, albeit dusty and behind on several paint jobs. When I picked up on this fact, I also realized the back wall of the wall cavity was the same blue and white striped wallpaper I'd found hidden underneath the stucco panels I'd removed from the living room. This meant the new wall had been installed long after the house was built. The plot thickens, I muttered to myself, wrapping my fingers around the door to the basement. I was only down there for 5 minutes. That was more than enough for my thoughts about flipping the place for a profit changed to fantasies about burning it down. On my descent down the basement steps, I walked, but coming back up them, I was sprinting and screaming. The smell hit as soon as I opened the door. Dank, musty, a hint of sweetness to it that suggested mold or rot. It didn't perturb me. I just figured nobody had been down there in years. Maybe a raccoon got in and died. Wrong on both counts, by the way. The last not terrified emotion I had today was the mild relief when my prying fingers found a switch on the cold wall in the dark. As soon as the basement was flooded with light from the grimy bulb, I yelled. Not in fear at first, just in surprise. I'd not expected the room to be furnished. I don't know what I'd expected in the 200-square-foot secret floor of my home, but it wasn't a rickety table with a small electric grill and chipped dinner plate. It wasn't a cooler in one corner, with a dark liquid overflowing in a trickle down one side. It definitely wasn't a small TV, displaying a static-laced CRT rendition of the local news. When I saw the beat-up TV, my gaze drifted to the wall behind it. I made another noise then, a kind of half yelp, half moan. This time it was out of fear, but not the full-on heart palpitation causing horror I'd feel by the time I'd reach the top of the stairs again. There were several hatches on the basement ceiling, complete with ladders that presumably lead to other wall cavities around my home. That's how whoever lived down here got around the house. I never went back in to see if I could find any of the holes they'd used to take the pictures. There were dozens of them pinned all over the walls. Polaroids, all of them half-blurred and bordered by the black of the wall or ceiling around the holes, each a peep shot through one of the many voyeur ports hidden in my house. Every picture was of me, sleeping, eating, showering, shitting, even fucking during mine and Allison's brief fling 3 years or so back. I started yelling when I noticed just how far back in my timeline these pictures went. The ones on the wall behind the bed were from when I moved in 5 years ago. Then, I turned around to look at the ones directly behind me, and saw straight away that even though they were through peepholes, they weren't taken in my house. They were taken in my parents' house, the one I grew up in. The most recent photo I saw was of me moving DIY tools I had no idea how to use into the living room. The oldest was of me when I was about 5. When I saw that one, of me sitting by the Xmas tree opening the Nintendo 64, a photo I'd seen so many times but from the angle of Mom's camera on the couch, I started screaming for real. My high-pitched shrieks coincided with the moment the bed started squeaking. I hadn't paid the bed much attention after turning on the light. The Polaroid wall-to-wall-to-wall-to-wall collage of my entire life took up pretty much all my focus. I did notice the bed when the mattress creaked, though. Something was moving underneath the gray, stained, moth-eaten blankets. My screams doubled in volume when the thing in the writhing folds sat up. By the time it turned toward me and spoke, I could feel the warmth of piss rivering down my inner left thigh. "What are you doing in my room, little brother?" I've never run so fast in my life. I didn't catch too good of a look at it. My fight or flight response kicked in pretty much the moment I heard the first raspy, crackling syllable. The hunched, rakish figure I managed to glimpse before hurtling myself back up the stairs was waxy, yellowish, and all bones with little muscle. What hair it did have on that lumpy scalp was thin, patchy, the kind of hair usually seen in those undergoing early chemotherapy or nuclear fallout exposure. The smell got worse when it spoke, wafting out its rotting throat from between chipped, blackened teeth. The eyes? From my short look into them, I remember small, shriveled things, puckered reddish orbs harboring wall-angled pinpoint pupils. None of that is why I physically can't bring myself to think too much about the thing living in its own filth under my house all these years, though. It's not even the photos, although speculating about those too long does start an onset of panic attacks spiraling. The reason I got in my car this morning and haven't stopped driving until I pulled over 13 hours later to write this is that something in that yellow, waxen, pustular face was harrowingly familiar. I tried calling Mom, Dad, and Hank dozens of times on the road. None of the three picked up, but that was my fault. I shouldn't have left those ranting, half-crazed voicemails after the first calls weren't answered. They're probably making arrangements right now, covering all this up again. I've got so many questions. Problem is, if I want to get answers, I'll have to head back into town. Back to where that thing that was living in my basement is. I don't know if I can bring myself to go back there, but I have to know. Why did it call me little brother? A couple of years ago, my now husband and I moved into our first home. Right off the bat, our not-so-normal home began to experience some paranormal activity. Nothing too weird, things moving around, light tapping or banging, nothing too sinister. After a while of living together, we decided to try for a baby and were able to conceive. 9 months later, out came our daughter. Now that might sound a bit unnecessary, but the problems seemed to start when we brought her home. The first 2 nights were okay, other than a massive lack of sleep. But night 3, it got a little worse. The light tapping began to get louder, more aggressive. The worst part was that we started hearing it more on her baby monitor rather than anywhere in our house. When we'd hear it, we'd watch for a few moments, only to realize that her eyes were open. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fussing. She was just awake, looking around. The scariest part was when she looked up at what was the ceiling and just seemed to start smiling. To this day, we don't know what she was looking at. We were just happy that she was okay. All right. Now bear with me. No, the title isn't misleading. I just needed to start from the beginning. My daughter is now 6, and the problems seemed to re-escalate, from banging on the walls, throwing things around. My daughter even told me that she has heard scratching coming from under her bed and in her closet. There's just one factor that I just can't shake, and that's the fact that she doesn't seem scared or worried. Recently, she's been sitting on the edge of the basement stairs, talking to nothing but darkness. When she spots me, she just looks up and smiles. My most vivid memory of this happened just last night. I was getting her ready for bed, and while I was grabbing her before bed, snack and drink, she was right behind me. When I turned around, she wasn't there. Insert creepy child whispering. I set her snack and drink down on our island, and when I went around the corner, there she was, whispering into the abyss. I got closer to her, and among her whispering, I could have sworn I heard something whispering back. Normally, my daughter turns around upon hearing me approach, but this time, it was as if I no longer existed. "I think you're starting to scare my mama," she whispered. No shit, I was scared. The second I put my hand on her shoulder, she jerked her little head back towards me, That was the first time I saw fear into her eyes. It soon relaxed when I pulled her up and shut the door. I still don't know why she looked at me so frightened. I hadn't meant to scare her, nor did I expect the reaction. During this time, my husband was a month into his work trip, 3 states away. I decided to test something out and asked my mom to look after her for a night or 2. Though hesitant, she agreed and took my daughter in for a few nights. Within these 2 nights, I decided to experiment. I noticed that while I slept, the sounds didn't seem to appear. I even downloaded a sleep app to document whenever a sound may have been made. During the first night alone, I went downstairs for a snack and the basement door was open. I didn't think much about it and shut it. During the second night, a similar thing happened. Only this time, when I shut the door, I heard something crash downstairs, run up the stairs, and begin scratching at the unlocked door. After nearly succumbing to a heart attack, I proceeded to run upstairs and call my poor husband, who was asleep. I explained the situation, and he told me to get a security camera. What he told me next was something I didn't want to hear. "Why don't you put it in the basement?" "Sure, let me just venture into the demonic basement to install a camera in order to catch what your child has been talking to in the dark." Sure enough, I ordered a security camera that same night and decided to go to sleep. By the next morning, there was a message on our answering machine sent from my mom. She was basically telling me to come get my daughter and that I needed to get her exercised. Here's the transcript. I must note that some things were a bit muffled, so I had to do my best. "Hey, honey. Though I had no clue why you asked me to watch your daughter for a few nights, I was thrilled to spend time with my grandchild. But I inaudible her. She always spends 10 minutes before bed staring down my basement stairs or down my hallway or anywhere there's complete darkness, and she just talks. Once she finally goes to sleep, there's about an hour before all hell breaks loose. Inaudible, please. Come get her. I want my calm back. I felt so bad. I knew I shouldn't have put her through that, but it was better her than a complete stranger. Upon hearing the message, I rushed to get my daughter. When I finally made it to my mom's house, I found my daughter in tears, dreading going back home. She clung to me tightly and just sobbed in my arms. I felt bad at first, almost mad, wondering what my mom had done to her. My daughter, a girl who rarely felt many emotions other than happiness, was crying. But then I remembered, 2 nights earlier, she looked at me with pure terror on her face. I was furious until I heard my daughter whisper something in my ear. I couldn't tell what she said at first, so I pulled her back slightly and asked her to repeat herself. "He wouldn't let me and Nana sleep. He wants me to come home." I nearly dropped her. Thanking my mom, I rushed to put my daughter in her seat and rushed the 2 of us back home. Luckily, my security camera came, and I was able to set it up on the fireplace, pointed right at the kitchen and the basement. The moment we got home, it was like no time had passed. She was no longer sad, we had fun, and I felt a little better. But like clockwork, by the time her bedtime came along, she asked for her snack and drink and went right to her spot. This time, she looks up at me and says, "Don't look into the dark." By now, I'm pissing my pants. I'm dragging her to her bed, disregarding her snack, ready to call a priest. I call my husband and ask him if he can come home sooner because I can't do this anymore. He says he's supposed to be back tomorrow by noon. Little did I know that putting her to bed would be such a dumb mistake. This time, the banging was right outside my door. It was loud. I thought I heard screaming, but the adrenaline made my head feel light, and the second I laid down, I passed out. The next day, I refused to leave my room until my husband got home. I let my daughter come into my room and we spent the time watching TV. When he finally got home, I insisted we look over the footage from last night. I didn't know we'd see exactly what was in the basement. When we looked over the footage, I saw that our daughter had gotten out of her bed and went to sit in her usual spot. What came from the darkness was purely terrifying. It looked like a figure, almost human-like. It had black holes for eyes, It looked skinned, yet it had patches of skin around some spots. I watched as the two talked. I skipped through a bit until I see her nod and walk toward the camera, pushing it downwards. It stayed that way until we fixed it this afternoon. Since then, we've moved and haven't really had any experiences lately. At least, nothing like that. I don't know what it was I saw, but to this day, I refuse to look into any little bits of darkness. I refuse to go into any basement, and I refuse to let my daughter sit in complete darkness alone. She's in her teens now, and doesn't seem to have any recollection of this ever happening. I just need answers. What was talking to my daughter? Is there a possibility of it ever coming back? Please help me.